Thank you all for coming. My name is Beshara Doumani. I'm Director of Middle East Studies here at Brown University. And welcome to Critical Conversations on Palestine, Israel. This is an ongoing series of events at Middle East Studies at Brown. The format is very simple. We try to model an informed conversation on tough and critical issues relating to Palestine, Israel, not in a CNN sort of style, this side, that side, or balance at the expense of content, but about recasting debates and questioning assumptions on the basis of people who have deep knowledge of the issues and imaginative ways of recasting them. The format is to bring a distinguished guest to Brown, who will speak for about 20 minutes to open up a particular topic. In this case, by special dispensation, Ian Lustick will be taking 25 minutes, I believe. Then we have brief responses by Brown faculty, about 7 to 10 minutes. And then we open it up for discussion. All comments and questions are welcome. We'll collect a few at a time, and then we'll have another round. We will strictly enforce a 30 to 60-second rule for questions and comments. So the theme for the fall 2014 Critical Conversation on Palestine, Israel is two states and illusion, question mark. As you all know, one or two states is code for normative political modalities by people on either side of the issue. The two states, often for those who prefer to have pure national ethnic states, and one state for those who talk about equality under the law regardless of ethnic origin or religion. But what is clear is that the one state already exists. Israel controls all of historic Palestine as defined by the British Mandate in 1922, as well as the Golan Heights of Syria. There is one regime, one condition, but completely different legal, institutional, other systems in place for different parts of the population inside this area. Adi Ophir and Ariel Azulai's book, The One State Condition, lays out this situation very clearly. Two states, of course, is code for land for peace, formulas which have been at the basis of every peace initiative, including the Oslo agreements since 1967, Resolution 242. And as we saw in the last few years, and in fact in today's New York Times and many commentaries in the past couple of years, the two-state negotiations have become in many ways a vehicle for preempting Palestinian rights to self-determination. And I would say finally it's also become code for how we conceive of a political future for this world, because stateless populations, because international global challenges have become part and parcel of everyday life. States are no longer the hegemonic actors that they used to be, and what happens in terms of trying to resolve an issue that is long-standing, but which the language of states does not fully capture, will become in many ways a model for how we think about issues elsewhere in the world. So there's a lot riding on this conversation, and we are very pleased here at Middle East Brown to bring Ian Lustick to talk about it. I've known Ian ever since I started my career teaching at the University of Pennsylvania, where he still is based, as a person of keen intellect, unorthodox imagination, moral courage, and a knack for strategic public engagement. I see him and I continue to really admire him as a person of principle whose only allegiances are intellectual rigor and a just and peaceful world. He's also a person who starts his talks with great hooks, and every time I look forward to that. In this particular case, we do have a hook for our conversation, and that is his September 14th op-ed in the New York Times, The Two-State Illusion, which is the basis for this panel today. That was published on Yom Kippur on a Sunday, and as an op-ed it was given, I think, roughly 3 or 4 times the size of a normal op-ed. Maybe he'll tell us more about that, but I think that the New York Times was trying to make a statement here about the importance of having this conversation, and I'm glad that we're having it. On a more conventional note, Ian Lustick is professor of political science and the Bess Heyman Chair at the University of Pennsylvania. He's interested in comparative politics, international politics, Middle Eastern politics, and agent-based computer-assisted modeling for the social sciences. He teaches courses on Middle Eastern politics, political identities and institutions, techniques of hegemonic analysis, the expansion and contraction of states, and on relationships among complexity, evolution, and politics. Every one of his books opened up a line of inquiry in which many others followed. Arabs in a Jewish state, Israel's control of a national minority opened up a big debate in the United States about Palestinians in Israel, which continues until this day, even actually more hotly than ever before. His book, this was in 1980. His book in 1988, For the Land and Lore, Jewish Fundamentalism in Israel, I think broke new ground by being the first systematic, serious analysis of the settler movement that plays a very important role today. His comparative book, Unsettled States, Disputed Lands, Britain and Ireland, France and Algeria, Israel and the West Bank, Gaza, in 1995, has been followed by many, many comparative, whether in history or political science, attempts at understanding the international dimensions and relationships between these particular areas, and the paradigm of settler colonialism in many ways owes a lot to the kind of path-breaking analysis in that book in terms of how we specifically look at the issues, not, of course, settler colonialism in general. And I can go on more. I'll stop there. The panelists, as our tradition, are all Brown professors, and they will not be introduced as you all are supposed to know them. I'll just say that what we have here is an interdisciplinary conversation beginning right after Ian finishes his introductory remarks with Professor Adi Ophir, who's a political philosopher and is a distinguished visiting professor of humanities at the Kogut Center for the Humanities and at Middle East Studies. Please feel free just to walk down. Followed by Nitsan Chorev, who's a sociologist and is the Harbin Family Professor of Sociology and International Studies. She's also Director of Development Studies at the Watson Institute. And then followed by David Jacobson, a Professor of Judaic Studies who works on literature. And finally by Nicola Perugini, a political anthropologist, and a Kogut Mellon postdoc jointly between Middle East Studies and Italian Studies. And I will not introduce them beyond that. I'd like to acknowledge that this event is co-sponsored by the Program in Judaic Studies and the Watson Institute. This event will be live streamed. A recording will be posted on our website after the event. And I would like to thank, as usual, our staff at Middle East Studies, especially Barbara Oberketter, and all the young volunteers and undergraduates who are wearing the Mohsen Namju t-shirts. Middle East Studies will be putting on the U.S.'s first international underground Iranian music festival, which will be in mid-November at Rizdi Auditorium. And with that, I'd like you to help me in welcoming Professor Ian Lustick.
Thank you, Beshara, and I also would like to thank in particular Barbara for the wonderful work she's done to support my visit and make this conversation, which I've been looking forward to a long time, a reality. I don't have much time, so I'm going to talk fast. So hold on to your seats. I received a great deal of notoriety as a result of the New York Times op-ed. It wasn't an ordinary op-ed, as anyone who's seen it actually in the newspaper knows. The pictures that they put with it, the prominence they gave it, set a certain kind of record, as far as I could tell. I've never seen anything like it. That's not what they prepared me for, though from the beginning they had said it was going to be on the front page, and I'd have a few more words than usual. One of the reasons I'm drawing your attention to this is that it's not as if I and Lustick wrote this amazing piece that was so brilliant, more brilliant than 4,000 other submissions that week. And the New York Times, in its wisdom, chose the most brilliant one. No, that's not how this works. Actually, I submitted something to an editor that I have had contact with in respect at the New York Times in June, a critique of American policy toward Egypt following the coup, in which I was worried about the Egyptians producing more terrorism in Egypt by their authoritarian behavior in order to lock the United States into a new alliance. So I got a call back from the New York Times saying, no, I think we're going to pass on this, but we have another idea. And the idea was, we think that really there's room for some new thinking about this Israel-Palestine stuff, and you're probably somebody who could do it. And I said, well, I am writing a book about that, but I'm not ready really to go forward with it. Well, think about it. Could we talk tomorrow? So we talked tomorrow, and I started riffing on it, and he said, wow, well, this is great. What are you doing for the next 2 to 3 weeks? I said, what? Well, we want to do the front page, et cetera, et cetera. It was originally going to be Labor Day. Labor Day, front page Sunday New York Times book review, but then the Syrians used chemical weapons, so no, can't do it then, because for 3 weeks there was no attention toward the Kerry peace process, which was the hook. Had to wait till that was done, and it ended up therefore not on Labor Day, but on Yom Kippur, or the day after Yom Kippur. Anyway, my point is that it wasn't just me who was thinking, my God, there's a kind of stultification of thought going on about this problem, a paralysis of the mind associated with a lock-in on a two-state solution or a path to a peace only through a diplomatic resolution via two states that prevents any other kind of thinking. That was really the opening. Now, to show you concretely just that there is a certain amount of massaging that takes place when you're writing an article like this in the New York Times, I'm going to first tell you that they took out, probably one of the lines they forced me to take out was how badly I felt about this situation. I just felt terrible that the two-state solution was no longer actually available. And they took it out. I said, well, we don't have room for it. I said, you don't have room? I'm gonna pay a heavy price for taking that out. Oh, that's too bad. This is the first paragraph originally in the editorial. At the end of Annie Hall, Woody's character tells a joke. This guy goes to a psychiatrist and says, Doc, my brother's crazy. He thinks he's a chicken. And the doctor says, well, why don't you turn him in? And the guy says, I would, but I need the eggs. Well, I guess this is Woody talking. Well, I guess that's pretty much how I feel about relationships. They're totally irrational and crazy and absurd, but I guess we keep going through it because, most of us need the eggs. And then I wrote, the best explanation available for the current round of Israeli-Palestinian negotiations is that they are totally irrational, crazy, and absurd, but everyone needs the eggs. So they took that out. Too long. There are two striking aspects to the enormous reaction to the piece, and I'm talking about 800 emails to me personally and thousands of postings on the web. They had to shut down the comments section of the New York Times for this article before it appeared in print. That is, in the middle of the night before it appeared in print, there were already 440 comments. Most of the commentary on the web is flack. That is, people who feel it's their mission in life, or they're paid, you call them 50 centers in China. You get paid by the word to attack any idea that somebody that you don't like in one way or another, even though the formula that you use has nothing to do with what was actually said. So, but in my own emails, I would say that about 60% of the emails were actually positive or relief that something new was being said, but still, maybe 5% obscene and about, 30% just disagreeing with me. But there were two aspects of the response I want to comment on, or just draw your attention to. One is that except for one person, in this whole maelstrom, except for one person, no one disagreed with what I said. That is, I said that these Kerry negotiations are doomed. There's no way they can succeed. And nobody, except for this one person, said the opposite. Said, no, you're wrong about that. They're going to succeed. So that was very interesting. The other interesting thing was the way I was coded, regardless of how many times I said in the piece that I was not putting forward a one-state solution. And I was coded immediately as, since he's no longer waving the flag of a two-state solution, therefore he's a one-stater. He wants the one-stater, will attack him because he's favoring a solution which has no chance, or which is ends Zionism or ends the state of Israel. That shows you how poverty-stricken the debate was. And the New York Times was actually correct. It's as if somebody tells you there are two directions in life. You can go north or you can go south. But there's no such thing as east or west. You're either, if you don't go north, then you have to go south. There's no east or west. Well, there's a lot of directions other than saying that there's a solution and it's two states, or there is a solution and there's one state, and I want to get into that. Instead, as Beshara mentioned, what I say in the article and what I still think is a really important thing to understand is the difference between a solution and an outcome. A solution means I don't just have a picture of somewhere I'd love to be, the Caribbean or two states or somewhere is a picture, but I have a plan for how to get there, and I think it's plausible I could get there. That's a solution. If you don't have the plan that you're willing to say you could do, all you've got is a picture. You don't have a solution. Well, I've got a two-state picture, and I have a one-state picture, but I don't have a path there. So therefore, I don't say that I have a solution. One state, however, is an outcome. We have one and only one state. The idea that whether it can be one state, obviously there can be. There is one state between the river and the sea, and the name of that state is Israel. Ironically, coincidentally, instructively, I'm staying in a wonderful hotel. Thank you, Barbara. The room is fantastic. It's called the Providence Biltmore. Now, anybody who comes from my neck of the woods, when they see Biltmore, there's one thing they think of, and it happened 72 years ago in the New York Biltmore Hotel, which was the Zionist organization meeting during World War II in which David Ben-Gurion declared, with the support of the whole Zionist movement, that the goal of Zionism was a Jewish commonwealth in the whole of Palestine, one state in the whole of the country. So 72 years ago, this was the objective of the Zionist movement. And now we have it as an outcome, not perhaps exactly the form that Ben-Gurion wanted it. Okay, so what I decided to do today is not to regale you further with the thinking that went into that article or other publications I've since put out that respond to my critics, which are easily available on the web, but to give you tools which I wasn't able to do in an article like that, to think about the future. Not only this conflict, but any, but particularly this one, to think in a new way that will allow, I think, us to substitute rational discourse that is productive for food fighting. So when we talk about the future, we are actually talking about mapping it. Because nobody can see the future. It doesn't exist, so you can't see it. What it is a space of possibilities. And so when we argue whether the one-state solution or the two-state solution, that's an illusion, or a delusion, what we are doing is we are forecasting whether or not certain things can happen. The essence of forecasting is navigation through a space, through an array. What do I mean by a space? Well, that's what I have to explain. It requires mapping a state space which looks different to us depending on which theories we use and which assumptions we make. Many of you may play chess. I'll assume you all play chess. You can randomly place pieces on a chessboard, but you don't know at all whether you could ever have a chess game that would arrive there, because chess has certain rules. Just like the political world and the social world and the physical world have laws. You can't get anywhere from here to there except what the laws of human nature and of biology and physics allow to happen. In chess, there are a certain number of rules. The state space of chess are all the legal positions that you could get to by legal moves. So that means once you start the game, there are a lot of moves that exist legally in the state space which you can no longer get to because you've lost your knight, you've lost one of your red bishop, and therefore you can't have any of the future state space that is a red bishop unless your pawn advances and somebody wants a bishop. Okay. You have to, so anybody who says that's an illusion is saying, when I look at the space of the possible and how you could get there from here, you can't get there from here. You can't. That's like when I used to live in Hanover, New Hampshire, and people would say, it's an old joke in Hanover, a very difficult place to get to in Vermont called Thetford. So the guy goes and asks the farmer, I'm trying to get to Thetford. How do you get there from here? He says, thinks for a while, and he scratches his head, and well, you can't get there from here. Well, there are some places that you can't get to from other places in a state space. All right. Now, what we're doing is, well, what are we arguing about when we argue about available solutions? We should not just argue whether we like that picture of the future or that picture of the future. That's a question of conceivability. We should ask more than that. We must also ask whether we can find paths from here to a better state, to one of those pictures, and if so, how plausible is it that we can follow that path without ending up in a much worse place? And now an example of that would be my argument that by continuing to do the Kerry style of diplomacy, you were actually following a path to that picture that is much more likely to consolidate permanent oppression in the area than it is to result in two viable states. So we are asking not so much really about possibility, but how possible is something? Now we're not used to thinking in terms of how possible is something. To us that means it sounds weird. It's either possible or it's not possible, but that's not actually the better way to think about it. It's how accessible is something in a state space. There are some things that you could get to, but 1 in a trillion would you ever actually get there. Other things are more possible in that sense, and we say they're more accessible in the state space. If you play chess, you know there are certain kinds of positions you get into that you're always getting into them. In some that are extremely unusual, you almost never get there. So let's think about a state space vividly. What is it? Well, you see what I have on the left here? That's a list of the cities in Kansas. That's not a space, that's just a sack of cities, a bunch of locations. You have no idea how hard it is to get from one to another. It's just a bunch. Okay, it's a list of the cities. It doesn't tell you, it's not a space, it's a set. Okay, a set is not equal to a space. When you're traveling through a real state space, you have to ask about the accessibility of locations. So you have a road map. If we assume, to make things simple, that we can only travel by car, then the roads tell us what cities are connected to what, how you get there, what's accessible. As you start driving, I'm not going to go through this complicated slide, as you start driving from the east to the west, and you have only a day to get here to Syracuse, Kansas, you're going to go on this road and turn left, turn south on 83. Well, as you go forward, by the time you get down there, basically all these other areas are impossible to get to in one day. So a bunch of the state spaces become inaccessible. But it's a very flat state space, and you can see the grid of roads. So as you travel, you can calculate pretty much where you're going and what options are still available, because you're in Kansas. But you're not always in Kansas. Sometimes state spaces are very rugged, and you can't change your plans at any time and say, well, I think I'll go back that way. Sometimes you live in New Hampshire, which is completely not like that. New Hampshire is mountainous, with an old road system shaped by the mountains and the rivers. And so if we, and here's a relief map of Kansas, a relief map of New Hampshire, and this is the main road system. You can see out a grid. You've got a big road going up there, and it forks off here to go to Hanover, or it forks off there to go to Littleton, Mount Washington. In a rugged state space, plausible destinations, things that were plausible at one point, can all of a sudden become virtually impossible. very implausible places. So imagine we're heading north from Nashua toward Concord for a day trip. Just imagine that. And we decide to go to Hanover. We're still going north up this road, up 91, or 89. But as we're going north, we're actually getting farther away from Littleton. So if we decided we wanted to actually go to Littleton, we'd have to go all the way back here and up. It's becoming essentially inaccessible, that part of the state space. And it happened just because of one decision that got made there, a fork in the road. So one of the things you have to assess when you're looking at a future of a situation is it like Kansas or is it like New Hampshire? Are you always able to go wherever you want and can pretty much navigate easily, or do you have to think in terms of discontinuities? Okay, now that means we have to start thinking about the world not in ways that people scream at each other. That's inconceivable what you're saying. No, what you're saying is inconceivable. That's an illusion. What you're saying is an illusion. Two of my critics just published publishing a piece, one of them, Asaf Sharon, in a book I have a piece in which he is called the one-state illusion. And it's a direct tack on it. So as if one has to be an illusion. And by the way, I didn't put that title on the article, the New York Times did. My title, maybe it wasn't as good, is The Dead Solution Walking. They didn't like that. Okay. So let's imagine the space of everything you can conceive of. That's a lot. That's a big space. Now, there are certain things you've never conceived of or are inconceivable, you know? Maybe there are billions of red ants living in the sun. Have you ever thought of that? No. But it's possible to conceive it. But there's a whole space of things that were never conceived of or are inconceivable. And then there are things that are conceivable but impossible, away enforced by any theories we have of aeronautics and physics can't exist. This is an interesting, everybody plays tic-tac-toe. This is a conceivable position, but it is impossible. Why? Because as soon as the XXX goes, the game is over and you can't put a third O down. So you could never get to that position. You can conceive of it, but it's impossible. So there's a whole bunch of things that are conceivable but impossible. And then there are things that are possible, but they're not necessarily plausible. We could have a population exchange between Bangladesh and the United States. I mean, it's not physically impossible. But it's so implausible, why would you even think about it, right? So when we're talking about two-state solutions, one of the things, or one-state solution, or one-state or two-state pictures, you have to think, well, how do I really think about this? Is it conceivable but not possible? Impossible now? It used to be possible? What category would I put it in? What other categories are there? Well, there's the probable, or I would say more accurately, the not improbable, since there can be multiple things that are not improbable. Inside that probable, there's this little tiny dot, this thread of actual that you can never know. And most problems of the scale of, in fact, I would bet every single problem that bears any relationship to the Arab-Israeli conflict, any architected solution, blueprint, never was actually what happened in the end. The actual was not the result of the implementation of a blueprint in that way. But here you have a way to think, categories with which to think and to talk. Gee, I used to think that the two-state solution was probable during the height of Oslo. Now, I'm not sure I can even think it's plausible. I mean, I'm not saying it's impossible, not yet, and I certainly can conceive of it. Whereas the one-state solution, well, I certainly can conceive of it. In fact, it's actual in a certain sense, but the kind of one-state solution I want, what is that? Is that possible but not plausible? You can start to have an interaction that's scientific, that's based on evidence, that's not based on emotion, that gets beyond the question of like it or not, do you have a picture, can I have a picture of something else? The result, so this means recasting the debate, and here I'm going to get away from the PowerPoint. So at the end of the talk, I want to get away from the PowerPoint. Instead of imagining a choice between one realistic solution and one inconceivable solution, We need to face the fact that neither one-staters nor two-staters can now offer accounts of a path from here to there that are persuasive enough to render that possible outcome plausible. We also need to face the fact that the degree of accessibility of a deeply valued state of affairs can change, and not just in a good way. We need to be able to say to ourselves and others just how we will know when that occurs. How will we know when something that was accessible in our state space is no longer sufficiently accessible to be more than possible as opposed to politically plausible? How do we know that? Everybody has to start thinking about how they could know that. One-staters say that they have a picture they like of a single political authority that satisfies the needs of Jews and Arabs. They must, but rarely do, discuss the political paths from here to there among Jews, among Arabs, and within the international community that could make that outcome plausible as a solution. Two-staters say the path they have been describing via brokered negotiations can work. They must, but rarely do, discuss the political path that can remove the obstacles to the success of those negotiations among Jews, among Arabs, and within the international community. Much hinges on serious considerations of the questions of just how accessible different visions of the future are. For example, whether this or that outcome has become only possible when before it was plausible, whether it has become not improbable instead of only plausible, or if it has become impossible when before it was at least possible. All of these questions mean different kinds of political action are called for. That different kinds of political activity are important. Sometimes it's contact your congressman or your lawmaker. Sometimes it's write an op-ed. Sometimes it's sit in your study and think of a new theory about the way the world works. Sometimes it's mobilization. Sometimes it's legal. Sometimes it's not. Sometimes it's violent. Sometimes it's not. If we believe that and now here I'm using Gramscian terminology for those who know or like Antonio Gramsci's work. If we believe the problem is simply what he called conjunctural, the way things happen to be right now in terms of a regular legal struggle over power, the kind we see every day, how do you move something that is already in the realm of the probable to become actual? That's, okay, call your congressman, gather names on a petition. How do you, or even if you want to try to take something that is plausible in your mind, you really can see how this could be done. What would incentivize people to get on board with this and in real time aggregate enough power to get it done? You can see how the plausible could be made probable. Then regular, direct, legal, political, and diplomatic action is definitely in order. But if you believe that making something that is just possible into something at least plausible is the challenge, then some kind of, what Gramsci calls organic crisis, some much deeper source of distress and dislocation will be necessary. These involve what he calls wars of maneuver and wars of position. Wars of maneuver mean not ordinary politics, but threats to break the law, to challenge legitimate authority, as, for example, the settlers in the West Bank did to deter repeatedly governments in Israel from evacuating settlements, or even in the early days negotiating toward a two-state solution. Or wars of position, which are struggles over what the categories of politics should be. Are we Israelis and Arabs? Are we Palestinians and Jews? Are we Semites? What is at stake here? Is it a national project? Is it the lives of men, women, and children? Is it world peace? In other words, wars of position reconfigure the units of political competition and make certain identities and certain cleavages important that weren't in the past. And that's another form of struggle. It's a form of struggle that acts directly on the state space, that doesn't take for granted that the analysis of what the space is and what is accessible has to be that way. In a meta level, with a meta theory, with a longer time frame, maybe we can change the state space. Obviously, that's a different kind of struggle, a longer struggle. And if we believe that what we can only conceive of must become possible even though it's not, and we don't know how to do that, then what? Then we must embrace what Gramsci calls molecular change. That is the slowest and most indeterminate of all. Change in the way we are, in who we are, and who the units are, how we operate, how we think, how we behave. Change linked to personal and existential commitments to values whose expression of those values, not to a one-state solution or a two-state solution or to any institutional arrangement, but to the values you want expressed, that they must be justified, those commitments, without any attribution to the activity of direct political efficacy. That's molecular change. Thanks.
So I've never been to Kansas, and I haven't heard what Anne said right now before, and haven't read it. But I think I'm going to speak about one space, which is part of the state space, in which there are probable and improbable, possible and impossible zones, just like this. And it is the terrain or the space of political discourse and political imagination of Israeli Jews, the space in which they think what is possible and what is not, what is probable and what is not. And this is, I would limit myself to this terrain. In the last few months, news on the death of the two-state solution have become viral, both in mainstream media and more so in social media in Israel. It took more than one op-ed in the New York Times to do this. For reasons I find hard to explain, I think it is the result of the last war in Gaza. But this is, anyway, this is what happened. Finally, a growing number of people on the Zionist left, and I emphasize the left, have come to realize that the one state is actually a fact, not a possibility, a geopolitical condition, not a solution. Aleph Bet Yoshua, the famous writer and a staunch supporter of an independent Palestinian state, admits in an op-ed in Haaretz that anyone familiar with that situation in the West Bank must acknowledge that a binational state is in the making, that it is taking shape and growing roots in the territories and has become inevitable. Gideon Levy reminds him and the readers in response that the binational state is here, not merely inevitable, and that in fact it has been here for decades. The only real question, he insists, is what kind of binational state this is going to be, an apartheid state or a democratic one. But in fact, this question is a rhetorical question, because the answers have been given, they are well known, and they are being reiterated every day in deeds, not only in words, through the construction of settlements and infrastructure and the destruction that comes along with it. For most people on the Zionist right, some public and diplomatic statements notwithstanding, for them there is and there will always be only one state between the sea and the river. And it is, this state is and will remain a Jewish state. What kind of state? A tiny minority has started recently to look for ways to grant citizenship to Palestinians without losing the Jewish control of the state apparatus. A larger minority advocates a system of differential ruling forever, a regime of separation, mishtar hafrada in Hebrew, in other words, apartheid, in which Palestinians will never be equal citizens. But the majority on the right solves the problem differently. The Jewish state will remain democratic and between the sea and the river by not counting Palestinians, the Palestinians whose lives the state dominates in one way or another. there are many ways for not counting. The most important one is claiming that we have not reached an agreement yet, and the Palestinians' statelessness is temporary. This is the only context in which the two-state solution should be addressed at the moment, because the diplomatic theater where the two-state drama have been played in the last 20 years has been instrumental in creating this sense of temporariness that have allowed not to count the Palestinians and not to account for the way they have been governed by the Israeli state. And this is a good enough reason to declare a moratorium on the debate on the two-state solution, and besides everything that Ian said. Apart from the theater of negotiations, the Oslo process and its collapse brought forth other means for not counting Palestinians. I don't have time to name them all. Briefly, there is the total exclusion of 1.8 million Palestinians in the Gaza Strip, which even the Supreme Court has approved, and of the almost 2 million living in Area A in the West Bank, because they are subject of the Palestinian Authority. Palestinians in Area C are relatively few, 300,000 at the most, and the more liberal nationalists are willing to grant them citizenship to complete the de facto annexation of this area. The number is small enough not to threaten the Jewish majority. The only open question for the right is what to do with Area B, 22% of the West Bank, and its few 100,000 Palestinians. And pragmatists on the right are willing to transfer control in these areas to the Palestinian Authority. But the most interesting proposal is one that may apply regardless of the area left for the Palestinian Authority, not the state, the authority. Its advocates, academics and politicians who call themselves liberal nationalists, simply propose to redefine Israel as a Zionist democracy. In a Zionist democracy, and I'm quoting more or less, paraphrasing, Arabs are regular citizens, Ezrachim Regilim, and Jews are citizens with privilege. That's a neat solution indeed. At any rate, no one on the right is willing to give up either Jewish control of the whole territory or Jewish supremacy. So the Zionist right responds to the question posed by Gideon Levy with massive constructions on the one hand and semantic creativity on the other hand. The Zionist left, which for a long time repressed the question, responds now with horror, despair, messianic hopes, as Ian showed in his response to one of them, and search for scapegoats. When the two-state solution can no longer serve as a smoke screen, the common ground between left and right-wing Zionists become apparent. Both abhor the idea of sharing the land and the state with Palestinians, and are scared of losing Jewish majority and supremacy. And since the left refuses to adopt apartheid, its defeat means total despair and calls for emigration. The difference between left and right among Zionists come down to this. The left thinks that both options, apartheid and democracy in a binational state, are catastrophic. The right thinks that only a binational democracy is catastrophic. The right has long accepted the ideology of separation within the same system of government as a solution, not simply as a cluster of temporary policies. One of the real signs of the recent transformation of political discourse in Israel is the fact that the right is now willing to adopt, and actually adopting, apartheid de jure, not only de facto. The avalanche of laws, regulations whose explicit purpose is to enhance differential ruling demonstrate this clearly. It comes together with the emergence of racism as a mainstream, acceptable ideology, tolerated in schools and in the mainstream media, let alone in the social media. The cognitive dissonance encapsulated in the mantra the Jewish and democratic state can no longer be sustained. Ideology cannot be so much out of touch with what most people do, how they live, what they see, want, and fear. the sea change in the discursive terrain is well entrenched in political reality. It would be wrong to say, though, that it simply represents this reality in any straightforward manner. Rather, this discourse is an essential component of the structure of power, contributing to the resilience of the Israeli system of control and differential ruling, which most Israeli Jews still call Jewish and democratic. The role of this discursive formation is, to put it shortly, to block the discursive horizon and abort in advance any possibility of change by incessantly reproducing the imaginary necessity to be cruel to one's Palestinian neighbors, cruel to the point of complete blindness. This state of affairs cannot be changed by persuasion. It is supported by a very strong majority and interests of Israelis who are too ignorant or too scared or too indifferent to humanist value or too tired and poor and powerless to seek an alternative. It will not be transformed if it is not forced to. What kind of force it would take to transform it, I cannot tell. There is, however, one kind of force that wouldn't help. This, as I know, armed resistance. Armed resistance has proven catastrophic for Palestinians and highly instrumental in the reproduction of the system of differential ruling. Instead of thinking how we can bring about the desired change, we must understand how we collaborate with the present regime and what we can do and what, in the current situation, we can no longer tolerate about it. We should disengage, and this, I think, comes close to the piecemeal approach that you proposed. So we should disengage for everything that we can no longer tolerate. Who are we? We are those who care about the people in Palestine, Israel, both Jews and Palestinians. It is in this context that we should open the question of the BDS, because the boycott, the divestment and sanction against the Israeli state and Israeli institutions. Because here, the BDS is a non-violent force that seeks a structural transformation, and it calls for a new discussion exactly like the one or two state solution. And it is in this context that we should address the very special and heavy responsibility of American Jews in the creation and legitimization of this intolerable Zionist democracy. For too long now, American Jews have been willing to tolerate every kind of injustice and evil done in the name of this democracy, ignoring the catastrophic consequences for their own psyche, culture, and religion, and for the future of the Jewish people.
Originally, you said Nitsav was going to be, should I be next? Or? Yeah, okay.
It's in order.
Okay, all right, very good. Okay, when I first started college, I thought I was actually going to major in political science. And I ended up majoring in English literature. And I think hearing the talk and the difficulty I had in following the level of abstraction means probably I was not cut out to be a political scientist, so with all due respect. I am a professor of literature, and I think in terms of narratives. And I like to think in terms of the role of narratives in this conflict. And I want to speak about the issue of narrative in the analysis that I did understand. I thought I understood much better the op-ed piece and a response that we were sent by Professor Lustick. And I think that as I view I want to, this isn't a total analysis of the situation, but I want to bring in something that nobody has brought in up until now, and that is the Zionist narrative. I think we have to take this very seriously. I think that we have to take very seriously if we are to, whatever's going to be plausible, whatever is going to be possible, we have to take into account both the steadfast loyalty of the majority of Jews to a basic Zionist narrative and the moral obligation of the world to support the basic goal of Zionism, which is to save the Jews from anti-Semitism, to allow them to defend themselves, and to provide them with some kind of a framework within which they could develop their culture in the modern period. I have a sense, I definitely got a sense from the original op-ed piece that Professor Lustick, that in some level, as we think on this level of abstraction, what's possible, what's not possible, I don't think that you would advocate this, but I think that you're willing to consider the possibility that if there could be a peaceful solution that would somehow dismantle the framework within which Zionism tried to deal with the issues of the Jewish people, that might be okay. I mean, you raised one question, again, maybe you don't stand by it anymore, but is state Zionism the only framework for satisfying Jewish national and cultural ambition? I think that's what Israelis still believe. And I think that we have to take that very seriously. I think we have to take seriously that that is what Israelis believe, and that anybody who thinks that a solution that is somehow going to, which I think the one-state solution would do, that is somehow going to negate that, I think is fooling himself or herself. This is not something that the Israeli people could ever support, the majority of the Israelis. And so, the notion somehow, or at one point in the op-ed piece, that it wouldn't be the end of the world if Israel no longer existed as a Jewish and democratic vision of its Zionist founders. And I think, regardless of what you think of it, I don't think it's a very realistic assumption somehow that the Jewish state is somehow going to be transformed into a binational, that we're going to have a binational solution. There are many false analogies that are constantly being used. They were in your op-ed piece. I think some of it may be implied by some of the things that Adi Ophir mentioned. And I think that if you use false analogies about what's actually going on, and of the self-understanding of the Jews of Israel as to what's going on, then again, you're doing two things. Sometimes it means you're actually distorting the truth, and sometimes it also means that you are simply flying in the face of what a very substantial population that now exists in this territory believes of itself. Probably the most blatant example of that in the op-ed piece was the quote, in which Professor Lustick said, that characterized Israel as a European fragment society that is attempting to institutionalize its presence in a non-European region without effectively eliminating the Aboriginal population. And you said, that's the first time that such a thing could possibly happen. That's not how the Israelis see themselves. I don't even think that's the reality. Tell half of the population that are Mizrahim that they somehow are a European fragment society. I'm not even sure what that term means, but I see the term European, at least. And I can go on to other kinds of false analogies. I think we have to start from the point of how people really see themselves, the commitment, the determination of the Jews of Israel to continue to have a Jewish state. Now, clearly, this is not something that exists in an ideal situation. And I have to say that since I was a young, to date myself, an undergraduate at the time of the Six-Day War, I've always been opposed to the settlements. So I want to make that very clear that I think the settlements are a barrier to peace. I do not think that it is very helpful. If anything, it's very destructive to continue to expand the settlements. But I think that we have to take into account, again, in terms of how we understand what's really going on, is this notion somehow that that there's a kind of a hardening of a position towards the Palestinians, that somehow Israelis have now just convinced themselves that they have to be cruel towards the Palestinians and they have to somehow take all rights away from the Palestinians. There's another part of this narrative that's missing, and that's the role the Palestinians have played in destroying the peace camp. Through things such as the Second Intifada, or even the rejection of earlier offers of partition. So I want to just conclude by also saying again, I don't know how this fits into to political science terminology or ways of thinking, but part of the narrative that I hear being said is that because it hasn't happened, it won't happen. That it's no longer plausible because all of the attempts to get to a two-state solution have simply not succeeded. I see that as logically, there's a logical fallacy to that, and I think history has spoken differently. We've seen many things that were seemed to be impossible, whether it's the peace treaty between Egypt and Israel in 1979, the withdrawal, people don't call it a withdrawal, but certainly the change in the status of Gaza in terms of the fact that there are no Jews living anymore in Gaza, whatever you want to call it, whether you want to say it's good or it's bad, that was unthinkable at one time. There was so much that was unthinkable at one time. It may be unthinkable to people that there could be a two-state solution, but if we're not working towards a two-state solution, then we are in effect saying that there cannot be a Jewish state, because I think it's very clear to everybody that and ultimately in the kind of one-state solution that most people are thinking about is going to be one in which there will be an Arab majority, and that will really, let's put it this way, that will make it highly unlikely, highly not plausible that the Jews will be able to have what they have a right to have, which is safety and security and an ability to chart their own fate, both in terms of politics and in terms of culture.
First of all, thank you, Beshara, for organizing this, and thank you for coming, Professor Lustick. Can you hear me? Yes. So Ian Lustick's piece in the New York Times does not mean to offer us easy solutions. Rather, it invites us to ask difficult questions. In particular, it invites us to think of alternatives to the one conventional solution that most of those who seek solutions to the situation in Israel-Palestine seem to embrace, that is to say, the two-state option. In my very brief comments today, I will try to follow Lustick's example by trying to think not so much about what the proper solutions are, but what kind of questions we may want to ask in order to move the conversation forward. I want to start this exercise with an analytical distinction, which I believe is important to think about and which is quite essential to Lustick's observations. The analytical distinction I want to make is between the question of what are the chances of reaching a solution and the question of what are the chances for the solution to work out. Of course, the fact that such distinction exists is unfortunate. It would be nice if bad solutions were difficult to find and good solutions were easy to agree on, but this is not the case, so the distinction stands. What I found striking in Lustick's analysis is that his pessimism is not in regard to the possibility of a functional two-state solution working, but in regard to the possibility of just getting there. In other words, his pessimism seems to focus on the inability of the two parties to successfully negotiate a two-state solution. Lustick's piece might not necessarily imply that a one-state solution would be easier to negotiate. I think that he denies this implication. But it does necessarily imply, I think, that a one-state solution is defendable as an alternative to two states only if the negotiations are more likely to succeed. Hence, my first question is whether or not a one-state possibility might be easier to negotiate, and what are the implications if it is not. The second question refers to the chances of the solution to work out. Here again, Lustick seems quite optimistic in regard to the ability of a one-state solution to succeed. Indeed, a lot of the criticisms against him pointed to the utopian version of the one-state option he described. But Lustick doesn't tell us much about how a one-state solution or how a one-state would fare compared to two states, and that too is worth asking about more explicitly. Let me start with the negotiations. Which negotiations are more likely to succeed? One way to approach this question is to ask what are the most contentious issues on the table and whether or not they would be easier to solve if we moved from negotiating two states to negotiating one. I want to mention here that Lustick takes very seriously the possibility that a quote unquote solution could be found or would be found not in negotiations but in more radical means, which I think includes violence. It seems quite clear to me that if a solution is found through violence, it will indeed be a one-state solution, but with very different characteristics than what Lustick must have in mind. But let me go back to the question of negotiations. The most contentious issues in the negotiations so far, as all of you know, are the borders, the right of return, and Jerusalem. I should mention that I quite conveniently ignore here the Jews' interest in having a Jewish state and the Palestinians' interest in self-determination, since those would be off the table as soon as the one state is seriously negotiated. It seems to me that the only issue that a one-state solution easily solves is, by definition, the question of the borders and related issues such as access to water. There will be no need to negotiate the line. Interestingly, the ones who would be the most immediate beneficiaries of having no borders are the Jewish settlers. Many of them would be forced to move under a two-state solution. It is indeed plausible that settlers, who have been quite influential, in killing the peace process would support a one-state solution, as we've heard, although again, likely not with the same characteristics as the ones Lustick has in mind. The borders, of course, are even more essential to the Palestinians. But what also matters, and would still matter under a one-state solution, is the right of return. That is to say, the right of Palestinians to return to their homes that their parents or grandparents were forced to leave. This is an issue that a one-state solution as such cannot actually resolve. At minimum, it is not clear to me why Palestinians would be more willing to give up on the right to return as part of a one-state solution compared to a two-state solution. Finally, there is the question of Jerusalem. Whether or not Jerusalem would be easier to negotiate under a one-state framing largely depends on the other arrangements in place. If what Lustick has in mind is some kind of a binational state with cultural as well as territorial autonomy, it is not clear that a one-state solution would make the negotiations over Jerusalem easier. And these are only the issues raised in the context of a two-state possibility. Of course, negotiating one state rather than two states would force negotiations over the internal affairs of the state as well, making things way more complicated. So to conclude so far, Lustick seems to be giving up on the possibility of a two-state solution because of the difficulties in negotiating it, not because of the desirability of the outcome. But this forces the question whether negotiations of a one-state solution would actually be easier. I think that, on the contrary, they will be more difficult. Now, I want to make it clear the difficulty of negotiating a one-state solution should not be a reason not to think about it as a solution. But it does mean that the difficulty of negotiating a two-state solution also should not be a reason not to advocate for it as a solution. This takes us to the second issue of the chances of each solution to work out. In the New York Times piece, Lustick offers a utopian image of multiple cross-ethnic integrations, but this tells us little about the reality one could expect. We need to ask what are the possible advantages of a one-state solution over the two-states alternative. A lot is at stake here, of course, but in this brief discussion, I would like to mention two issues that seem particularly important. One is the impact of each alternative on sustainable coexistence. The other issue is the impact each one of the alternatives has on the question of justice. In regard to the possibility of lasting peace, it is reasonable to assume that if the political economic system is designed in a way that is democratic, mutually respectful, and fair, there will be less likely occurrences in which one of the parties is tempted to start a war against the other. As we know from the very many instances in recent history of civil wars and violent attempts of secession, this is not necessarily the case. It is also not the case that war is a likely outcome of a two-state solution. I do not think it is. Still, future violence might be less likely under the one-state option than under the two-state alternative, where the risk is that one nation will be defined in opposition to the other one. In regard to the question of justice, here again a one-state solution could potentially offer a better outcome than two states. I believe that any future agreement should include the responsibility of the State of Israel for improving the economic and social conditions of Palestinians. Again, if, and only if, the one state is designed fairly, there are reasons to think that one political economic entity will be more properly distributional than in the case of two states, at least in the long run. It seems, therefore, that there could be substantive reasons to support one state over two states, although it is likely that there are other substantive considerations that would lead us to the opposite conclusion. But here's the paradox. The only condition under which this could be a more favorable solution or a more favorable situation is if the procedures and conditions and mode of governance and all the other things that would make the one state a just state are all successfully negotiated ahead of time. So to an extent, one could reach exactly the opposite conclusion implied by Lustick, that while a one-state solution could be preferable, it is actually even less probable than a two-state solution is. This does not mean we should not discuss the possibility of a one-state solution. On the contrary, we should take it very seriously. But we should also be open about the inevitable challenges, both at the stage of negotiations and at the stage of implementation, that need to be resolved for this to work out. Thank you.
I want to start my response with a quote from Ian's article on the New York Times and try to generate a debate by putting it in conversation with another article that appeared on the same newspaper some months before. So here is the quote I chose from Ian's article. The issue is no longer where to draw political boundaries between Jews and Arabs on a map, but how equality of political rights is to be achieved, end quote. In a piece entitled The Two-State Formula for Israelis and Palestinians is Impossible, published on the New York Times in March 2013 in concomitance with President Obama's visit to Israel, Danny Dayan, the former chairman of the settler umbrella organization Yesha Council of Jewish Communities in Judea and Samaria, expressed with these words his skepticism towards the two-state solution. I quote, "The most Obama can do is help improve security and human rights on the ground for Israelis and Palestinians. The two-state formula is a mirage. The closer you get to it, the more you realize that it is just hot air. It is neither coincidence nor bad luck that 20 years after Oslo, we are not 1 inch closer to that goal. The truth is that failure is inevitable. But President Obama can choose to make a difference. Significant improvements on the ground that will tangibly benefit the lives of millions of Palestinians and Israelis are what is most urgently needed. Let's launch an ambitious and comprehensive program to improve security, human rights, freedom of movement, economic prosperity, dueling conditions," end quote. So one of the biggest challenges for those who argue in favor of a common democratic state in Israel-Palestine is precisely this. The settlers in the West Bank, like the settlers in Tel Aviv, for instance, Israel's President Rivlin, are aware of the two-state paradigm's failure and have been increasingly adopting a language that in many ways mirrors that used by the supporters of a one democratic state solution. When these different settler political actors argue in favor of a one-state solution, they do it by deploying a language that is, at least formally, very similar to their counterparts on the left. One of the key problems of the discourse of equal human rights for all, and more broadly the rights discourse, is that this discourse has been repeatedly mobilized in the past in order to reinforce and enhance settler colonialism in Israel-Palestine. Let me provide you with some quick examples. In 1948, the creation of Israel took place within a human rights framework. As I show in my forthcoming book with the Israeli scholar Niv Gordon, the creation of the State of Israel took place as a reparation for human rights violations and translated into a colonial project for human rights. Settler colonialism, one of the key political forms of domination in the genealogy of the Holocaust, as Arendt and other thinkers have highlighted, became the paradoxical solution in Palestine for the horrible extermination of Jews in Europe. Another example, almost 50 years later, after the 2005 disengagement from Gaza and the dismantlement of the Gaza settlements, the settlers started to deploy the language of equal human rights in order to denounce the disengagement carried out by their government as a violation of their basic human rights. A third example, in the coming weeks, the Knesset will commence the discussion of a law about the division of the Al-Aqsa compound in Jerusalem and the extension of Israel's sovereignty to the area as a measure aimed at protecting equal religious rights for both Jews and Muslims. Thus, the question I want to share with the speakers and the audience today is, how do we disentangle the discursive overlapping on equal rights and human rights that the proponents of a democratic common state solution face? How to mark a difference between an appropriation of the language of equal human rights aimed at fostering settler colonialism and one aimed at decolonizing Palestine? How to distinguish a decolonizing common state solution from a recolonizing one? I think that one of the ways to avoid the transformation of a one-state solution into a reproduction of historical injustice, and the risk is a very concrete one, as many Israeli, Palestinian, and international voices highlighted, consists of conceiving this solution as a process of verification. I understand this notion of verification in three different but intertwined ways. Firstly, by verification, I mean what Frantz Fanon meant when he employed this term in The Wretched of the Earth, and I quote, "Decolonization implies the urgent need to challenge the colonial situation. Its definition can be summed up in the well-known words, the last shall be first. Decolonization is verification of this," end quote. So for Fanon, verification means the verification of a relationship of domination and the dismantlement of the existing hierarchies of power in the colony. The colony as a political form is not reformable. The last shall be first. Secondly, by verification, I mean what Jacques Rancière means when he speaks of the rights of man in an article entitled, "Who is the subject of the rights of man?" For Rancière, every political subjectivization, every crafting of a political subjectivity within the framework of a citizenship based on the equal rights of man implies verification. So political subjectivization in the name of freedom and equality are not something that can be fixed a priori. As he explains, and I quote, "Freedom and equality are not predicates belonging to definite subjects. Political predicates are open predicates. They open up a dispute about what they exactly entail and whom they concern in which cases." End quote. A common state solution would precisely mean the creation of a new political subjectivity as a process of verification. In Isratin or Pal-Israel, you see, we already have a problem with names and we need a verification. The verification Rancière refers to would be precisely a dispute between two conceptions of citizenship and between two political conditions which are not merely geographic, one based on settlerhood and the other on the idea of a decolonized subject citizen. And here by decolonized subject citizen, I mean both Jews and Palestinians. Verification means, to say it with Rancière, to put to test the power of political names, their extension and comprehension. Finally, verification would mean what Edward Said, not too differently from Rancière, meant when he explained his conception of human rights struggles in an article entitled "Nationalism, Human Rights and Interpretation," and I quote, To be for human rights, in effect, means to be willing to venture interpretations of those rights in the same place and with the same language employed by the dominant power, to dispute its hierarchy and methods, to elucidate what it has hidden, to pronounce what it has silenced or rendered unpronounceable, end quote. For Edward Said, verification is an operation of interpretation. It means to verify how political power deploys the language of equality and human rights and to reveal the fallacies of this deployment. Verification means to be in the same place of power in order to reveal the paradoxes of its discourse of equality and human rights. And to be in the same place of power means that we have to take seriously, almost at face value, the vindication of equality and equal human rights developed by the settlers of the West Bank and the settlers in Tel Aviv, and verify it. To conclude, verification in our case would mean to try to answer the following question: who is the subject of rights in the common state of Palestine-Israel? The question is particularly difficult because the articulation of a political answer should include the colonizer and the colonized alike, the descendants of those who expelled as a reparation for human rights violations that took place elsewhere, and the descendants of those who were expelled, the dispossessor and the dispossessed, those who became citizens in the name of return to the promised land, and those who, because of this return, are not allowed to return to their homeland. In other words, we should make an effort to verify what it means to be an unprecedented citizen, a binational returnee citizen. Thank you very much.
Thank you all very much for these very thoughtful papers. When we first started this project, we were thinking of informal conversation, and I think you all just took it to a much higher level. So I will give a chance now to Ayn Lustick to respond to the responses, and then we'll open it up for discussion.
Thank you, and I agree, Beshara. I think people took this, their assignments very seriously, and I'm delighted and honored. And I want to be brief because I'm very interested in hearing the audience's comments and questions as well. So I'm going to go through them in order, making very brief comments. Okay. Well, with respect to audio fears, actually, I agree with almost everything he said. So I'll only tell one brief anecdote about the last thing that he said, which was to think about the BDS movement. As an academic who regularly goes to Israel, who has spoken repeatedly at every Israeli university, just about every year I go there and do that. I've done tenure reviews and promotion reviews and every conceivable kind of service for Israeli universities. It's very difficult for me to handle the calls for an academic boycott. What is not difficult for me to do is boycott the institution Ariel that is now called a university by the Israeli government because it is in occupied territory. So the problem is this. And I'll tell you a story, you can see why. I oppose the idea of anyone discriminating against Israeli scholars on an individual basis, and I sit regularly on panels with professors from Ariel University. I have no problem with that. But I will not be contaminated by the occupation. So when I was recently asked by the Israeli Science Foundation to review a proposal from a well-known Israeli university, right in my field, a very nice proposal it looked like to be, I realized that if I responded to that by reviewing the proposal, as I usually would do, I would just be waiting until they sent me one from Ariel. And then I would say, no, I won't do this. And that I would then be discriminating against an individual professor, the professor at Ariel who put his application in. So I wrote to the Israel Science Foundation, and I said, I've always done these. I would love to continue to do them. This is a perfect opportunity for me to do it. It's my field and so on. But I can't be contaminated by the occupation. I need to know, and I don't want to discriminate against a scholar in the future who will come from Ariel. So I need to know that the institution in Ariel that is now called university cannot benefit from this competition. Only if you tell me that that institution cannot benefit will I participate. And they could not give me that assurance, so I no longer am doing Israel Science Foundation reviews. That's an example of the way the situation has been transformed from a state that occupies a territory that's not itself to one that's totally entangled and makes it extremely and growing difficult for anyone to continue to make that kind of distinction without being contaminated. That's also one of the limitations of thinking just in terms of two states versus there's a two-state, there's occupation, it's temporary, and that's the only options. I turn to David's remarks, Professor Jacobson's remarks. And here, of course, I have the most disagreements. I would just essentially list them. I certainly believe that we have to take into account the Zionist narrative. I'm all for doing that. I'm writing a book now that's very much on the role of the Holocaust narrative. But one of the things you learn when you look at those narratives is how they change. And what you talked about was as if there's this Zionist narrative, and whatever it claims has to be honored because it could never change. But you can't, as you put it, fly in the face of the Zionist narrative because it's espoused by most Israeli Jews. But in fact, the whole Zionist narrative, when it started in the late 19th century, flew in the face of the narrative that the overwhelming majority of Jews had, as you well know. So narratives of all kinds change. The Zionist narrative of itself has changed. I can show you narratives from Ben-Gurion and Weizmann in the 20s and 30s produced that actually deny ever wanting a Jewish state, but only want even a continued British rule. It all depends what the circumstances are, and you find out just how large the repertoire of available narratives are within a community. And part of what I'm doing is indeed trying to destabilize the idea that, oh, heavens to Betsy, he's actually implying that we could think about a future for Jews in the Middle East without an armature called a Jewish state, which, by the way, only the Kahanists know how to define. No one has ever given me a definition of a Jewish state that they've been willing to live with for more than 3 minutes of conversation with me, except Kahanists. Second, you speak about false analogies. That's a tricky, you didn't actually, with one exception, say what you meant by the false analogy. But in fact, most analogies aren't false or true. They're just useful or not useful. Anything that would be a perfect analogy would be completely useless because it would be like repeating the same thing. So the question is not false or true, but useful or not. When I refer to, and here I'm going to mix my response to David to Nitsan's, because Nitsan is focused on whether negotiations can lead with a greater likelihood to a solution via two states or via one state. And I like that, based on my presentation, you can see I would like that kind of measurement. But one of the things I insist on is that negotiations itself is not only the preferred way to move forward, it's almost it's very difficult, I won't say inconceivable, it's very hard for me to see progress being made by any kind of negotiations. Now let's take an analogy here. I wrote a couple books on Ireland and Algeria, and Britain and Ireland. Let's look at the history of Ireland and Britain. Britain ruled Ireland as a colony for centuries. Then it annexed the country in 1801, a mostly Catholic country with a lot of Protestant settlers. From 1800 to 1829, no Catholics were allowed to vote. Protestants could vote, but no citizenship was given to the Catholic Irish, even though they were now part of the United Kingdom. It took decades of struggle, much longer than it took blacks in the United States in a way to get the vote once they were not slaves, to be able to exercise Catholic political power in the British Parliament until the late 19th century when it became an important force. So important that with the stress of World War I, you ended up with the secession of Ireland, with part of it, the part basically on a loan plan, where Northern Ireland still unhappily sits inside of Britain with a Protestant majority. What does that show you? That the binational state, the United Kingdom, which was first not a democratic one, ended up to be a two-state solution, which may not be without negotiations toward that, okay, in any important way. Okay, so you can have, so that's why I would respond in a way to one thing that was said by Nikolai. He points to Donnie Dayan's very interesting op-ed. Isn't Donnie Dayan saying what Lustick is saying? I mean, he's using Lustick's argument as a trick. How can we disentangle this? The settlers are saying, yeah, see, the two-state solution is no good. Let's give them some rights. I say, don't disentangle. Call them on it. Implicate them further in the democratic discourse. In other words, you say, fine, I want annexation now. I much prefer, now what was that based on? That's based on my values, which may not be the same as other people's values, may not be the same as David's. My values are very explicitly, and I put them down: democracy, equality, and non-exclusivist opportunities for self-determination. The Palestinians and the Jews in that land don't have any more right to self-determination if by doing so they exclude the other from having it. So that's what I'm fighting for. I don't care whether it's 3 states, 4 states, 14 states, 2 states, 1 state. Those are the values that I'm fighting for. And I can see a lot of ways to animate a struggle toward those outcomes. I have some other things to say, but I will only say that on the logical question that David brings up, since many things that were impossible were thought to be impossible have happened, one cannot say that something is impossible and won't happen. But, in fact, most things that we have always thought were impossible have never happened and will never happen. It's just sometimes some things that are impossible turn out to be possible. So just because somebody says it's impossible does not mean it's possible. Okay, that's the logical error. Okay, thank you.
Okay. So we'll entertain any questions from the audience. Please be brief. There are mics that we can pass around, or you can just simply go up. Why don't you go ahead and in front of the mic, if you don't mind, because it's being live streamed.
Something is amiss here. You're talking about one-state solution, two-state solution, but you never define what do you mean. You never define one state, you never define 2 states. Can you elaborate what is a 2-state solution?
I can say what I mean. I think probably everyone would agree on the panel with this. A one-state solution would be a political arrangement where there's only one apparatus of power between the river and the sea, and that within it, the relationships are satisfying enough for all concerned that it is peaceful and there are no deep, outstanding sentiments of injustice. A 2-state solution would have the same thing, except there would be 2 apparatuses of power territorially defined.
Would each one of the states will have army, navy, air force?
Well, that would be...
Those details are important.
From my point of view, it doesn't matter. What I said goes. If they can agree on each has an army, neither has an army, one has an army, but the other doesn't, okay? Whatever leads to a situation where they don't feel that there are deep injustices remaining and they both are satisfied with it is fine with me. I don't want to insist on more conditions. I'll leave it up to them.
Where among those circles your position stays?
That's in the edge of the possible.
Correct. I think it's impossible.
Okay. That's the kind of discussion I think we need to have.
Or inconceivable.
Well, you did a pretty good job of conceiving it because you asked the question.
Elias?
I have a question about, you said in your final remarks, you said that you could think of several ways of animating the conflict towards one of these, towards the solution of the struggle. And for those of us who have not had a chance to read some of the other writings besides the op-ed, I'm curious about if you can give us 2 or 3 of those solutions. So if you can give us East and West.
Solutions, no. I didn't say I had for you a solution. You're not asking for one either. You're saying, well, what kinds of activities, given the things you said, would be animating productive struggles?
Well, I mean, you said there's 1 state and 2 state, North and South. But so can you just encapsulate quickly East and West?
Toward 1 or 2 states. What I'm thinking, if you're asking for pictures of the future, that's a different and somewhat less interesting question. I talked to settlers in the West Bank who have a very interesting picture of a cantonal arrangement. These are fringe people, but they are becoming known because they are willing to remain living in a Palestinian controlled area. And they want cantons. So I said, oh, you mean you here next to Bethlehem will be in a Arab canton, whereas the rest of Gush Etzion, the Arabs who live there, will be in a Jewish canton. They said, right. I said, well, what about in the Galilee, where there's 90% Arabs in the central Galilee, 90% of the Israelis living in the central Galilee are Arabs. There are some Jewish localities now there. Will they be living in the Arab canton? Yes. Oh, and how about immigration? Will Jews be able to immigrate into the Galilee? No. Now, that's consistent. That's really interesting. That's the kind of thinking I'm interested in. I'm interested in thinking about identities and affiliations and narratives. We have David Ohana wrote a book on the Mediterranean option. There's a lot of thinking about, as I say in my piece, you know, I call myself Ashkenazi, which means German. If most of the people, Jews like me, can call themselves German, you know, this close to World War II, it's not inconceivable that the Easterners, i.e. the Jews from Arab and Muslim countries, can't someday come to see themselves as Arabs. So there's a lot of interesting thinking in that line. Another productive thing would be to think about when the Palestinian Authority ends and it can't put pressure anymore on Arabs in East Jerusalem not to vote, because there are 260,000 Arabs in East Jerusalem and they have the right to vote in municipal elections but generally do not. But if they did, they could swing the balance of power in the city of Jerusalem to either the seculars or the Haredim and actually establish their rights in the city. This could be a model for how the left in Israel could someday benefit by enfranchising all Arabs in the West Bank and Gaza, which is how the liberals won their elections in the late 19th century in England, by seeing that they could only do it if the Irish Catholic masses got the vote, because they vote for parties that would align themselves with the liberals.
Hi, I have a question. You guys talked about the one-state and two-state solution, but I was wondering what you guys thought about the three-state solution. In Gaza, you have it's controlled by Hamas, and Hamas doesn't really like Israel. In the Constitution, they don't accept the existence or right of Israel to exist. So I was wondering if you think it's even a viable option, and if not, how should Hamas and Gaza be incorporated in a two-state solution or a one-state solution?
Somebody else would like to take a crack at that? Let me just make a comment on pronunciation, and I do not want to pick on you. You are just too typical, so don't take it personally.
Okay.
Israelis say Hamas, the Hamas. There's not chet, okay? It's not a chet, it's a Hamas, okay? It's an actual word. It's a very grating thing. It's like you say Iran or Iraq, which is not how you say the country. So but it's a way of actually not taking seriously the people who live there. It's okay. That's one thing. But I think that if my grandfather would say alavai, that you could have Gaza, you treat it as a state. Fine. Let's see how it works. Let Hamas have a state in Gaza. Let it function that way. Let's recognize it. Let's negotiate it with it. Israel does secretly. Why not do it publicly? Let's see how that works. Then we start at least with the 2 states, and then maybe we can move to 3, maybe even 4. I don't care much about the institution. I'm not wedded to it. People criticize Gush Amunim, the settlers, for worshiping the land, treating it as an idol. And I'm one of those who criticize Gush Amunim for that. But I also now criticize people who worship institutional arrangements, displace their attachment to the 2 states or even the 1 Jewish state. When Samuel asked God, give me a king. The Yidden, the Jews want a king. They want to think, you know what God told him? No. That's a stupid idea. And Samuel said, no, I know it's stupid, but the people want it. They want to be like the other countries. And God said, but they'll take your sons. They'll take your money. The king will make wars. He says, look, what can I do? Mela, I have to give them. So he says, okay, so make Saul the king. But the point is, the holiness is not connected to the institutional arrangement. So your answer to the question is, I wouldn't mind an experiment where you actually allow Gaza to be a state or a statelet and see what happens.
Okay. Anyone else? Okay, maybe then I'll ask a question and see if, I very much like the idea of thinking about conjectural war position or molecular struggles. It opens up this relationship between outcome and practice that modalities such as one state, two state, et cetera, that are normative preferences do not open up. So I heard Adi say that violence or armed struggle, as you called it, is counterproductive and therefore not an option. But I also heard saying that BDS is a possible option. But I've heard Ayan say that actually it depends on each person to carry out what they think the outcome should be, and therefore that will rule what kind of struggle that they do, if I understood correctly. What I didn't hear from Nicola is how does one get to a decolonized subjecthood? Through what kinds? Is it going to be through molecular, war position, conjectural, or some other way? So underlying much of what everyone's saying pretty much is that there's an ethical issue involved here about what people are willing to do or not willing to do in order to realize their beliefs. And so I'm just opening it up to the panelists to say, where do you see yourself in terms of your own beliefs about what ought to happen and how best to get there in terms of actual practice? Nicola?
I'm in favor of a war of position, but I'm not sure I have the authority to rule out the possibility of armed struggle for Palestinians. I think armed struggle is something that comes from an internationally recognized framework of legitimacy. I come from a country in which, at a certain point, armed struggle was against a regime that had become too oppressive was the option. And I'm not saying if it functions or not. I'm saying I'm not here to tell Palestinians what to do. A war of position in which BDS functions as a means for creating this the we that is going to constitute the subject of rights in Israel-Palestine is an option that I see as with favor. I think BDS has the strength to bring together the two constituency and define subjecthood within the future state. BDS is this a process of definition and verification, in which you put some kind of rules, in which the aim is clear. The aim is the collapse of the current regime, so all actions, even molecular actions carried out in every part of the world in order to bring the regime to a collapse is important. And in this process, what is constituted is a constituency. Israelis are integral part of the BDS movement, and Palestinians are. So I think that the war of position in which, and that is going also to create some kind of criticalness that the other solutions and the other political practices have dissolved. So I think that is my way of seeing what to do. Can I add just one thing? With return, because I think that what we are forgetting constantly in the discussion is return. The new constituency is a new constituency in which there will be a new polity in which those who were expelled will have to be reconsidered. So it's not simply an adaptation to the current state of things.
I just want to make clear that I didn't propose I didn't speak about the armed struggle as an advice or as a way to tell the Palestinians what to do. I was talking about it from the perspective of what kind of force can shake this structure of control and the Israeli political system or Israeli political rule over the land as a whole and over the Palestinians in particular. I would say two things here in response to your question, Beshara. First of all, I was very serious about moratorium on solutions. I don't think we should speak about solutions. I think that at least not in a way which is detached from the way the discourse of solution functions in the maintenance of the Israeli regime. It is much more important to simply to analyze and explain what is the situation. Because I think there is so much misunderstanding and so much misconception about it that this is our first responsibility as intellectuals, to simply to tell what is there. And to add to the question of the boycott, I think that what I said in the very last words of my talk, the support of the American Jews, the unquestioned support of the American Jews to the Israeli state is I think the challenge of people like me. This is where I see my input, because what is at stake is not only the future of Palestinians, it's the future of the Jewish people.
Okay. Yeah.
Yes, Professor Lustick, quick question. I guess I'm going to try to pin you down. Based off your schematic of the degrees of unlikelihood, which, if any, scenarios do you think are probable today?
That's a fair question. As I said, I would prefer to say which are not improbable. Okay? And I think that apartheid is not improbable. I think that what we are getting, that's where we are virtually now, and it's the most probable of all the kinds of futures that I can see over the next 5-10 years. Is a tightening of and a much more explicit regime of separation that is, as was mentioned, finding expression in a variety of new laws and regulations. I think even today, and we saw an article about the defense minister pushing a program for separate buses for Palestinians and Jews. My own feeling, again, in answer to your question, and I'll be very concrete about it, we have an interesting situation in East Jerusalem. I mentioned it already. You have hundreds of thousands of Arabs who do not have Israeli citizenship, but they do have permanent residency. It's a delicate thing. Israel takes it away when it wants to, but they have a certain thing called permanent residency in the municipality of Yerushalayim. The West Bank Palestinians do not have this, and that's why they can't come into Israel. The Israeli and the Arabs inside of Israel proper, that is not in East Jerusalem, but in the rest of the country, they have citizenship. They can vote. But as anyone who's been following Israeli politics for the last few years knows, that not only from Avigdor Lieberman, but from many sources, a whole slew of laws and practices toward Arabs in Israel have been stripping away, hollowing out the meaning of what it means to be a regular Israeli citizen, or not a Jew, that is, to be an Arab citizen. And I think that at the same time, you have voices such as Donny Dayan's, but others, who start to intimate the possibility, F.E.A. Tom, for crying out loud, talking about giving certain kinds of citizenship in certain ways to Arabs in the West Bank, certain of them. So I can see a future that's not improbable, where all of the Arabs start to have the status of East Jerusalem Arabs now. Arabs inside of Israel lose that edge that they have, and Arabs in the West Bank, some of them start gaining a little bit, so they have more rights than they do now. I don't believe that's a very stable situation either, mainly because of BDS, because of the overwhelming presence of Muslims and Arabs in the Middle East compared to Jews, and because of the military situation and what I think is the probable nuclearization of the region. So that will fire up orders of magnitude greater forces that will impinge on this conflict. But if you're asking me about what I see in the next 5 to 10 years, that's what I see.
Anyone else? Okay, Ramon.
I just wanted to ask how we can, at the same time that we talk about two parties and two groups and make this kind of simplistic binary division, how we can also account for all of the rifts, the fissures, the divisions, the different subgroups that exist within these two groups. For example, among different Palestinian groups, depending upon where they live, under what laws they're subject to, but also within Israeli society and the severe issues of socioeconomic distress and oppressive policies and how they're impacting people's imaginations and their views of what is possible. I think that part of the discussion hasn't really arisen. It's almost as if Israelis are. I mean, there's been a little bit about settlers and different groups, but it almost falls into kind of a monolith of Israelis are this, and clearly there's some severe social issues that are also behind what's going on, and those have to be taken into consideration when also imagining what kind of solutions are possible and visions are possible. Just curious about anybody's thoughts on those.
Absolutely. I mean, I think it is a binary, not just, what's the binary? Jew and Arab, Israeli. It's not Israeli Arab because there are lots of Israeli Arabs. So it is you can't even speak properly. You have to enter that. I think there's a lot to be said for the fact that the conflict is maintained at the level it is by those who politically benefit from it, in part as a way to submerge those other things, to allow you to do with the religious and to do with the wealthy and to do with the poor what is done, because after all you've got this existential threat all the time that you can point to. So I think there's that relationship. There's also the hopeful side of it, that is, the more you can disaggregate the two sides, the more you can imagine different kinds of incentives coming up that link subgroups within the two societies. I mentioned in my article the weird fact that the Islamic movement representatives in the Israeli Knesset voted with the ultra-Orthodox because they both wanted segregation and they both wanted kosher food in certain facilities that weren't there. So there are ways in which, politics makes strange bedfellows. I will close by saying that line that you've all heard, politics makes strange bedfellows. Of course, we see it in the Congress all the time. But when it really counts, it's when politics is rough. And we haven't had rough politics in the United States since the Civil War, thank God. But that kind of rough politics, when both Israeli Jews and Palestinian Arabs feel that the present situation threatens their existence in the country, that's when you'll get a reorganization of identities. And that's what is needed. And when Adi talks about force, I understand what he means. He doesn't mean Palestinians taking up arms. The question is, what's the order of magnitude of the kinds of geopolitical forces that have to be at work in order to dislodge this embedded cultural, sociological, and political apparatus in Israel that is blocking the routes to any kind of democratic solution of this conflict?
Could I just say something about political change within Israel? Again, I'm not a political scientist. But I think there's some misconceptions when we think about political change in Israel. I hear a lot of talk about a state which is moving to the right, which is moving towards apartheid, and if only we had BDS, then somehow the policies would change. I think we have to take into account the role of Palestinian actions in defeating the peace movement. And I haven't heard any talk about that in terms of, I think you alluded to the fact, I think that certainly many people in PA have concluded that the Second Intifada was a disaster for them, that it was the wrong policy, it really hurt them more than it helped them. I think that it is possible for Israeli politics to swing back, just as it has already swung back and forth. But it's not necessarily going to happen through BDS, through American pressure. It ultimately, I think, has to happen internally, and to some extent, a factor that is not being taken into account is that that it has to be, that there's a responsibility of the Palestinians for this mess. And I have the sense somehow that we're being asked to kind of bail out the Palestinians for some of the major strategic mistakes that they made. Not accepting partition in 47, and launching a second intifada that got them nowhere, only more suffering, and then the war that only brought Hamas, got them nothing, and brought them more this summer. So I'm concerned about the fact that we're not talking about that, about how Israel could actually change. I'm not saying that the solution is therefore somehow the Palestinians are going to bail out Israel either. But there's a sense of there's a dynamic here that I'm missing. I'm missing that sort of dimension of the impact of the Palestinians on the internal workings of Israeli politics. Look, at the settlers and their supporters are a very small percentage of the population. They are in power because of the coalition system that allows small minorities to actually have power. But we know that in the time of Oslo, the vast majority of Jews were willing to support a two-state solution. And so why was that? And why couldn't it return to that? I think it could return to that under certain circumstances. I doubt it would happen now for all sorts of reasons, especially the chaos in the Middle East.
Oh, you were looking at me like you want to say something or not say something?
I always want to say something, but I want to make sure everybody else has a chance. Well, I mean, let's have a direct conversation about that, because you've said some really important things. First of all, I agree with you that the Arab side of it that makes a negotiations toward a two-state solution much less likely than it used to be, it hasn't been discussed. And I have discussed it in my piece. I point to the fact that Islamicization of the Middle East, including Islamicization of the Palestinians, and the radicalization of the Middle East towards Zionism, which resulted from something that you didn't criticize, namely the first Intifada, which sounds as if you would think that was a good thing, because it helped educate Israelis to the need to end the status quo. Well, you can't depend on your enemy to be fully cooperative in educating you about what you should do. Most countries don't have that kind of a nice enemy. The Jews had a pretty good enemy in the British, but other than that, their enemies have not been so useful. But I would say that one of the reasons that I have shifted my evaluation of the prospect, the accessibility of a negotiated two-state solution, is precisely because of the anti-Semitism that rages in the Middle East now, including among Palestinians. But in Egypt, for example, it's one of the most anti-Semitic, if not the most anti-Semitic country in the world. Now, where does this come from? This doesn't come out of nowhere. This comes out of the behavior of Israel and out of the constant barrage of images of Arabs and Muslims being killed by Israelis. I mean, the numbers can't lie completely. You can come up with all kinds of, well, that was intended, this wasn't intended. But when you have 1,000 to 1, sometimes 100 to 1 normally deaths of children, it has an effect over 20, 30 years. And that effect is transmuted in part into an anti-Semitism that makes it much harder for any Israeli government, whether it was a leftist government or not, to take the risks that it used to be willing to take to get out of the West Bank. It just makes it more and more, that's another reason why the accessibility of that negotiated solution has moved so far away. I completely agree with that. What I have not heard you say, David, and maybe is, you said under certain circumstances, there could be a shift back You could get, in other words, you could get a government in Israel willing and able to establish a viable Palestinian state alongside of Israel. You haven't said what those circumstances are. All of a sudden, the Russians stop acting like 500,000 Putins. All of a sudden, the ultra-Orthodox start becoming more liberal instead of the most chauvinist and extremist group in the society. All of a sudden, the Mizrahim start to feel that their interests are really aligned with these leftover Ashkenazi liberals from Tel Aviv and not from the Likud. I don't know. That's what I mean by tell me a path that I can believe in, that I can even hope for. What is, you say, under certain circumstances? Which are those circumstances? Enormously strong American pressure after the Congress has been eliminated in a military coup that puts a president in power that doesn't have to worry about the Israel lobby? What is the set of circumstances you're thinking of?
Well, I don't know what they are, but I think that if you is that if all those people who you assume cannot possibly be in favor of a two-state solution, at one time the majority of Israelis did. So it's possible.
The question of whether you can, that's why my whole point is nothing is possible unless you can get from here to there. Being able to paint a picture that looks like it was once attractive or is attractive doesn't mean it's possible.
You're not going to get from here to there if you're going to try to dismantle the Jewish state.
Well, what's the there? A two-state solution, that's for sure.
What's the Jewish state? Is it the
So
Jewish?
maybe I can come in at this point by way of getting at political correctness issue that I don't know if the young man was here when he said Hamas instead of Hamas. And I want to call you out on something, Ian.
Good.
and that is your constant references or switching back and forth between Arab and Palestinian. Yeah, it's not Arab Jew. If I know you don't think of it as a ethnic or religious conflict, not primarily. So when you
I learned this switcheroo from the Palestinians. Sometimes they'll talk about living side by side with the Jewish people, but then it's the Israeli state and a Palestinian state,
right,
which is not symmetrical,
right,
because you can have Arab Israelis but not Jewish Palestinians. So I learned how to be.
Why can't you have Jewish Palestinians?
Well, maybe you can, but not in the discourse. Not in the discourse that's proper. But at any rate, is it? So you're asking, do I see the conflict as Arab, Israeli?
No, actually, I'm leading to
Palestinian,
something else. Actually,
okay.
I just saying that if we insist on rules of political correctness, and some people may not, it's going to be difficult to even get started sometimes. But I think that using the word Palestinian instead of Arab to refer to Palestinian citizens of Israel instead of the Arabs in Israel, etc.
Which is the lingo you prefer now? For those people who hold Israeli citizenship who have on their ID cards that they are Arabs, what do you call them?
Palestinians.
Palestinian citizens of Israel?
Right.
Okay, fine. I've studied them in detail, and over the years, they change their moniker constantly, and even among them, you can find changes.
Oh, yeah.
So I'm not sure, and besides, I never care about what's politically correct anyway, but...
well, I'm just calling you just like you called on somebody else as a way of getting to another point, so let me get there. The other point has to do with, I take it that everybody cannot imagine a future in which there's no Israelis or Palestinians, that one will be there and the other one will somehow, by some miracle, disappear. Right. I'm assuming that people, how they think of themselves might change, how they identify themselves might change. They may not think of themselves as Palestinians or Arabs or Jews, but we're not talking about a miraculous disappearance.
The people will still be there.
People will still be there.
They call themselves
right. And that these people, whether they live in a one-state, two-state, or 1,000 states or no state, will, because it's a very small area with very limited resources, et cetera, have to find ways of living together. True. Right? And therefore, what you said earlier about being motivated by principles of equality, of et cetera, regardless of what the political arrangement is, would be the only way to really move forward. let's not call it negotiations, let's not call it anything else, let's just say that this is the ultimate goal. And yet, at the same time, you say that there are so many powers invested in the status quo because they benefit greatly from it, that you can't imagine, and I think Adi is right and you agreed with them, anything other than a massive force of some sort, whether it happens a little bit at a time or it happens all at once like in a natural disaster, or whether the United States wakes up the next day and says, I'm changing my policy on this issue, but it has to be something absolutely massive, or cumulatively massive, or suddenly massive, to really make a difference. And the question is, are the populations that exist there now possible, is it possible for them to even adjust to this massive change unless they've been through a molecular struggle to begin with? So here's the paradox, right? Any way you look at it, there's a paradox.
Well, there's a paradox, except thank God we're living in a world where lots of us disagree. So some people are going to treat it, and David might be one of them, as a situation of ordinary politics where we're trying to make something that's plausible into something that's probable, and we're going to give money to peace now, and we're going to help that happen. And there are some of us who are going to think that it's actually a molecular struggle, and we're going to we're trying to change people's consciousness and change them, whether they're Arabs or Jews or Americans, into really seeing what nationalism is and is not, and look for a totally different kind of politics. And there are some people going to think in terms of a war maneuver, which means illegal activity. I didn't say necessarily violence, but illegal, and that can be on all sides of the political fence. And there are going to be some who think in terms of a war of position, that we can actually organize molecular change and lead it by articulating positions, and this is partly what my article is. I am mainly involved in a war of position. David recognizes it well, because what he recognizes, the dangerous part of the article, or the important part of the article, is that it does say, you know, since you can't get there, the two-state solution from here, then start thinking about other ways you can get democracy, equality, and mutually exclusive, non-mutually exclusive self-determination. And that doesn't necessarily mean a Jewish state, and it doesn't mean that this Zionist project is going to be the one that succeeds, or that any Zionist project will be the one that lasts. Let's remember, it is a project. That whole breaking of a hegemonic order, which starts from the position of course, you're going to have a Zionist state, just like the Exodus novel says it exists. When you break that, it's a big threat, but it does then open up things we can't even see now. Once you get rid of that, you can start to think in new ways. So that's the deeper reason why I wrote it. Tomorrow we're doing this thing on two-state solution as a degenerative research program, which sounds bizarre, but what it really is about is what happens if you're a scientist, and let's say you're a Newtonian and Einstein comes along and it just throws your whole world out of whack. How do you respond to that when you realize that your paradigm doesn't solve the problems that are important to be solved? Well, the same thing operates in politics. When your paradigm of the assumptions you make about the world. So what I do is I look at philosophy of science to see, well, how do scientists respond to that? And what is crucial what's the psychological level, what's the political level, what's the intellectual level? How do you operate without a paradigm, without going nuts? And that's where a lot of people reading my article felt so much anxiety, because I'm telling them that they should trade boredom and repetitiveness for anxiety.
All right, with that, I think we will conclude. Thank you very much.